Every time you get sick, every time your body reacts too strongly to something harmless, or fails to react quickly enough to something dangerous, part of that response may not come from modern humans at all. It may come from a different kind of human, one that walked the cold landscapes of Eurasia tens of thousands of years before written history. A human that no longer exists, but whose biology never fully disappeared. The modern body carries traces of older lineages, and most people are unaware of just how active those traces still are. What feels like a personal, individual reaction to illness or stress is often the echo of something far older. The story most people have heard about Neanderthals is incomplete. They are usually described as a separate species, a failed branch of the human family, a group that vanished long ago. But genetic evidence has changed that picture entirely. We did not simply replace them. In some sense, we absorbed them. Small fragments of their DNA were folded into our own, and those fragments did not stay silent. They became part of how the human body manages threat, regulates inflammation, and decides how strongly to respond when something invades it. This is not ancient history. It is current physiology. What we inherited from Neanderthals was not a story or a legacy in the cultural sense. It was a set of biological instructions, written into specific genes, some of which still help us survive, and some of which quietly increase risk. These instructions affect immunity, skin, respiratory response, and even how the body handles certain modern diseases. They influence outcomes in hospitals, allergy clinics, and autoimmune diagnoses, even when no one in the room is thinking about evolution. To understand what your Neanderthal DNA reveals about you, we have to look not at identity, but at function, at the quiet, biological work happening inside you right now. The story begins with a migration, not a meeting. Around 60,000 years ago, small groups of anatomically modern humans began moving out of Africa in waves, carrying with them a biology shaped by African environments, African pathogens, and African climates. As these groups expanded into the Middle East and later into Europe and Asia, they entered territory that was not empty. Other humans had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. Among them were the Neanderthals, a population that had adapted, generation by generation, to the harsh conditions of Ice Age Eurasia. The encounter between these two groups was not brief, and it was not purely hostile. The interbreeding events that followed are now well documented in the genetic record. Evidence suggests that these encounters happened multiple times, in multiple regions, across thousands of years. They were not single dramatic moments, but a long, scattered overlap between two human populations sharing the same landscapes. The result of that overlap is something modern science has been able to read directly from ancient bones. By extracting DNA from Neanderthal remains and comparing it with the genomes of people alive today, researchers found something remarkable. Neanderthal DNA had not disappeared with the Neanderthals themselves. It had quietly continued forward, inside us. For most people of non-African ancestry, somewhere between 1 and 2% of the genome is Neanderthal in origin. That number sounds small, and in a sense, it is. But the human genome contains billions of base pairs, and even a small percentage represents a significant amount of inherited biological information. More importantly, that 1 to 2% is not the same 1 to 2% in every person. Different individuals carry different fragments. When you add up all the Neanderthal DNA still preserved across the global human population, a much larger portion of the original Neanderthal genome survives, scattered across billions of living bodies. This is one of the most important things to understand about Neanderthal ancestry. It is not a trait. It is not a single feature you either have or do not have. It is a mosaic, a patchwork of fragments distributed unevenly across populations and individuals. One person may carry Neanderthal variants linked to immune function. Another may carry variants linked to skin or hair. A third may carry variants associated with how the body processes certain compounds. No one is more Neanderthal than anyone else in any meaningful functional sense. The fragments are simply different, and they affect different systems. The geographic pattern of this inheritance also matters. Populations whose ancestors remained in sub-Saharan Africa generally carry little to no Neanderthal DNA, because the interbreeding happened outside that region. This is not a deficit, and it is not a disadvantage. It is simply a reflection of where these ancient encounters took place. Human biology is not a hierarchy. It is a record of where ancestors lived, what they faced, and which adaptations were available to them. The presence or absence of Neanderthal DNA tells us about geography and history, not about quality. Why did any of this DNA survive at all? When two populations interbreed, most foreign genetic material tends to be filtered out over generations, especially if it does not provide a clear benefit. Yet, certain Neanderthal fragments persisted, sometimes at higher frequencies than would be expected by chance. This pattern strongly suggests that those particular fragments offered some kind of advantage to early modern humans entering new environments. The Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to Eurasian conditions. Their genes carried solutions that modern humans, newly arrived, did not yet have. One of the strongest signals in the surviving Neanderthal DNA involves immune function. When modern humans moved into Eurasia, they encountered pathogens their immune systems had never seen before. Building immunity from scratch takes generations, and many individuals would have died in the process. But Neanderthals already carried immune adaptations tuned to those local pathogens. Through interbreeding, modern humans acquired some of these adaptations almost instantly, in evolutionary terms. It was, in effect, a biological shortcut, a way of importing immunity rather than developing it slowly through exposure and loss. Other persistent fragments relate to skin and hair biology, including genes involved in keratin production and skin barrier function. These traits would have mattered in colder, drier, less sunny environments where skin needed to behave differently than it did in equatorial Africa. Some variants influenced pigmentation and the body's ability to produce certain compounds in low-light conditions. Again, these were not random pieces of DNA. They were specifically the kinds of adaptations that would have helped early modern humans survive in landscapes their bodies were not originally built for. It is tempting to imagine all of this as a clean exchange, a kind of beneficial transfer from one group to another. But the reality is more complicated. Some Neanderthal variants that helped ancient humans survive in their original context now behave very differently in modern environments. The same immune sensitivity that protected against ancient pathogens can, in today's world, contribute to chronic inflammation or autoimmune dysregulation. The same metabolic adaptations that mattered during cold, food-scarce winters may interact poorly with modern diets. Inheritance, in biology, is rarely simple. What helped one generation can quietly burden another. This is the foundation we need before going further. Neanderthal DNA is not a relic or a curiosity. It is a functional, active part of the modern human genome, distributed unevenly, shaped by ancient migration, and selected for reasons that made sense in environments most people today will never experience. Understanding what it actually does inside the body requires moving past the idea of Neanderthals as a separate, extinct species, and beginning to see them as one of several ancestral populations whose biology still operates inside us. In the next part, we look at exactly how this DNA works, where in the body it acts, and why it matters in modern medicine. To understand what Neanderthal DNA actually does, it helps to remember what DNA is for. Genes do not store memories or personalities. They store instructions. Instructions for building proteins, regulating processes, and responding to signals from the environment. When we say someone carries a Neanderthal variant, we mean they carry a slightly different version of a specific instruction, a version that originated in a different human population tens of thousands of years ago. That variant may change how strongly a process activates, how quickly a system responds, or how a particular protein folds and functions. Small differences, repeated billions of times across cells, become measurable differences in biology. Many of the most studied Neanderthal variants cluster around the immune system, particularly the part of immunity called innate immunity. This is the body's first line of defense, the system that reacts within minutes or hours of detecting something foreign. It does not require previous exposure. It does not need to learn. It simply recognizes general patterns of threat and responds. Research indicates that several Neanderthal-derived variants influence how this rapid response is triggered and how forcefully it unfolds. In effect, they adjust the sensitivity of the body's alarm system. A useful way to think about this is to imagine a smoke detector. A more sensitive detector catches fires earlier, which is good, but it also reacts to burnt toast, steam from a shower, and dust in the air. A less sensitive one ignores false alarms, but may miss a real fire until it has spread. Neither setting is universally better. The right setting depends on the environment. Some Neanderthal-derived immune variants appear to push the detector toward higher sensitivity, an adjustment that would have been valuable in pathogen-heavy ancient environments, but which behaves differently in the cleaner, more controlled conditions of modern life. Other Neanderthal variants influence the skin, which is itself a major immune organ. The skin is not just a barrier. It actively detects threats, produces antimicrobial compounds, and communicates with the rest of the immune system. Genes affecting keratin production, skin thickness, and barrier integrity have all been linked to Neanderthal ancestry in certain populations. Medical observations show that skin behavior, including how it responds to dryness, cold, and certain irritants, can vary along these genetic lines. Once again, these are not dramatic differences. They are subtle adjustments in how the body handles its outermost surface. Inflammatory signaling is another area where Neanderthal DNA leaves its mark. Inflammation is the body's way of mobilizing resources to a site of injury or infection. It is essential to survival. Without it, simple wounds would kill us. But inflammation is also costly, and when it persists too long or activates without a real threat, it damages tissue. Several Neanderthal-derived variants affect the signaling molecules that turn inflammation on and off. The presence of these variants can shift the balance, making the response slightly more aggressive, slightly more prolonged, or slightly more sensitive to certain triggers. Compatibility, in this context, refers to how well these ancient adjustments fit modern conditions. Tens of thousands of years ago, an immune system primed for rapid, strong responses was an advantage in a world full of unfamiliar microbes, parasites, and wounds. Today, in environments with cleaner water, processed food, fewer parasites, and constant low-grade exposure to allergens and pollutants, that same primed system can misfire. The threats it was tuned for are largely gone. The triggers it now encounters are different. The hardware has not changed, but the environment has, and the mismatch shows up in clinical patterns. Rarity also enters the picture, but in a specific way. While Neanderthal DNA itself is widespread among non-African populations, certain individual variants are quite rare and concentrated in particular regions. Some variants are common in East Asian populations and almost absent in Europeans. Others appear at higher frequencies in specific groups, depending on which ancient migration routes their ancestors followed. This regional patchiness explains why studies sometimes report effects in one population that do not replicate in another. It is not contradiction. It is the geography of inheritance. Medical relevance becomes clearer when we look at specific conditions. Research indicates that certain Neanderthal-derived variants are statistically associated with risk levels for autoimmune diseases such as lupus and Crohn's disease. Others have been linked to differences in how the body responds to viral respiratory infections. Some variants appear to influence blood clotting tendencies, allergy susceptibility, and inflammatory skin conditions. None of these associations mean a person carrying the variant will develop the condition. They mean the baseline probability shifts slightly in one direction or another when other factors are added. What makes this medically interesting is not the size of any single effect. It is the cumulative pattern. A person may carry several Neanderthal-derived variants, each contributing a small adjustment to immune sensitivity, inflammatory response, or barrier function. Most of the time, those adjustments balance out. Occasionally, in the wrong combination or the wrong environment, they tilt the body toward a particular vulnerability. Modern genetic medicine is beginning to map these patterns, not to label individuals, but to better understand why people with similar lifestyles and exposures sometimes have very different health outcomes. It is important to be precise here. Neanderthal DNA does not cause disease in a deterministic sense. It does not give you allergies, autoimmune conditions, or respiratory complications by itself. What it does is contribute one of many inputs into how the body is configured. Diet, environment, stress, infection history, and dozens of other genetic factors all interact with these ancient variants. The honest scientific position is that Neanderthal ancestry is one thread in a very large fabric. It is real, it is measurable, and it matters, but it is never the whole picture. Recognizing that is essential before discussing what these variants gave us and what they may quietly cost. Every inherited trait that survives long enough to reach the modern era was, at some point, useful. Evolution does not preserve neutral fragments easily, and it does not preserve harmful ones at all unless they are linked to something beneficial. The Neanderthal DNA we still carry passed through tens of thousands of years of filtering. The fragments that remained are the ones that, on balance, helped our ancestors survive long enough to reproduce. Understanding the original advantage is the first step in understanding why these variants persisted, even when their modern effects are sometimes harmful. The clearest historical advantage involved pathogen defense. When modern humans expanded into Eurasia, they encountered viruses, bacteria, and parasites that had been circulating among Neanderthal populations for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthal immune systems had already adapted to these threats. Their bodies had developed receptors, signaling pathways, and inflammatory responses tuned to local microbes. By acquiring fragments of Neanderthal DNA, early modern humans gained access to these adaptations without needing to evolve them from scratch. It was, in evolutionary terms, an enormous shortcut, and it likely saved countless lives during the early phases of expansion. A second advantage involved climate. The environments of Ice Age Europe and Northern Asia were brutally cold compared to the African landscapes where modern humans first emerged. Survival required adjustments to skin, fat distribution, and the way the body conserved heat. Neanderthals had already made these adjustments over hundreds of thousands of years. Some of the genetic variants modern humans inherited from them appear to influence skin barrier function, hair characteristics, and metabolic responses to cold. These were not dramatic transformations, but small, useful adjustments that made survival in harsh environments slightly more achievable. A third advantage was timing. Evolution by natural selection alone is slow. Waiting for beneficial mutations to appear, spread, and stabilize across a population takes thousands of generations. but interbreeding allowed entire packages of pre-tested adaptations to enter the modern human gene pool in a single generation. This is part of why Neanderthal DNA persisted in such specific patterns. The fragments that survived were not random. They were the ones that solved real problems and that gave the humans who carried them a measurable edge in environments they were still learning to inhabit. But every advantage carries a cost, and this is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. The same immune variants that helped ancient humans fight off unfamiliar pathogens are now associated with elevated risk for several autoimmune conditions. When the immune system is tuned for rapid, aggressive response, it sometimes misidentifies the body's own tissues as threats. Research indicates that certain Neanderthal-derived variants appear more frequently in individuals with conditions such as lupus, Crohn's disease, and certain inflammatory disorders. The advantage in one era becomes a liability in another. Allergy and asthma patterns show a similar trade-off. A more reactive immune system, more sensitive to environmental triggers, was useful when those triggers were genuine threats. In the modern world, the same sensitivity often responds to pollen, dust, animal proteins, and food components that pose no real danger. Several studies have found associations between specific Neanderthal-derived variants and allergic conditions, including hay fever and asthma. The body is not malfunctioning. It is responding exactly as it was tuned to respond, in an environment that no longer rewards that tuning. Respiratory illness is another area where these trade-offs become visible. During the recent global health crises, researchers identified certain Neanderthal-derived gene variants that appeared more frequently among individuals who experienced more severe outcomes from respiratory viral infections. This is a sensitive finding, and it must be framed carefully. Carrying these variants does not determine outcome. It does not guarantee severity. It represents a statistical association, one factor among many, including age, underlying conditions, exposure level, and access to care. But the association is real, and it illustrates how ancient adaptations can interact unexpectedly with modern diseases. Inflammation itself sits at the center of these trade-offs. Acute inflammation, the kind that responds to a wound or infection and then resolves, is essential to survival. Chronic inflammation, the kind that persists at low levels for years, is increasingly understood as a driver of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and certain cancers. Some Neanderthal-derived variants appear to nudge the body toward more sustained inflammatory activity. In an ancient environment full of acute threats, this would have been protective. In a modern environment full of chronic low-grade triggers, it can become a slow burden on the body. Skin and barrier-related variants also carry costs. Adaptations that helped skin retain moisture and resist cold may, in certain combinations, contribute to conditions like eczema or other inflammatory skin disorders. Medical observations show that some of these conditions cluster within populations carrying particular ancestral variants. The skin that protected an ancestor from a freezing northern winter may, generations later, react more strongly to detergents, fabrics, or environmental allergens that did not exist in any meaningful concentration 10,000 years ago. It is essential to hold all of this in balance. Neanderthal DNA is not a curse, and it is not a gift. It is a record of compromises made under specific pressures, in specific environments, by specific ancestors. The fragments that survived did so because they helped someone live long enough to have children. Whether those same fragments help or hinder a modern person depends on factors no ancient human could have anticipated, including indoor living, processed food, antibiotics, vaccines, and chronic exposure to novel chemicals. The biology is the same. The world it operates in is unrecognizable. This is why framing matters so much in any discussion of Neanderthal ancestry. The temptation to describe these traits as making someone stronger, weaker, more primitive, or more advanced is not just inaccurate. It is biologically meaningless. There is no functional sense in which any modern human is more or less Neanderthal than another. There are only individuals who carry slightly different fragments, in slightly different combinations, navigating an environment none of those fragments were designed for. What matters is not the label. What matters is understanding how these inherited adjustments behave inside a modern body. The practical relevance of all this is quieter than people expect. Most individuals will never feel their Neanderthal DNA. It does not announce itself. It does not produce a symptom you could point to and recognize. It operates underneath ordinary experience, adjusting how strongly the immune system reacts, how the skin holds moisture, how inflammation rises and falls. For the vast majority of people, these adjustments stay within the range of normal variation. They are part of why no two people respond to the same illness, the same allergen, or the same environment in exactly the same way. Where this knowledge begins to matter is in the spaces where biology becomes medicine. People with autoimmune conditions, persistent allergies, or strong inflammatory responses sometimes spend years searching for explanations. Genetics is rarely the full answer, but it is increasingly part of the conversation. Understanding that some of the body's baseline tuning may come from ancient ancestral populations does not change a diagnosis, and it does not change a treatment plan. But it can change how a person understands their own body. It replaces the idea of a body that is broken with the idea of a body that is configured for a different world. This shift in understanding has value. There is a difference between believing your body is failing and recognizing that your body is responding, perhaps too strongly, to conditions it was not built for. Neither framing changes the underlying biology, but the second one is more accurate and more compatible with the kind of care, patience, and attention that chronic conditions require. The body is not a mistake. It is a record. A long, quiet record of choices made under pressures that no longer exist. Awareness also matters at the population level. Modern medicine is slowly moving toward more personalized approaches, ones that take genetic background into account when interpreting risk and response. Ancestry plays a role in this, not as identity, but as biology. The variants a person carries, including those inherited from ancient populations, can subtly influence how diseases present, how medications are processed, and how diagnostic tests should be interpreted. None of this is ready to be applied universally yet, but the direction of medicine is clear. Genetic context is becoming part of clinical context. For now, the most useful thing any individual can do with this information is hold it lightly. Knowing that you carry Neanderthal DNA does not require action. It does not call for testing, treatment, or worry. What it offers is perspective. The next time your body reacts in a way that feels disproportionate or fails to react in a way you expected, it may help to remember that the system making those decisions is older than you, older than your parents, older than recorded history. It is doing its best with instructions written for a different world. Responsibility in this context is not personal. It is collective and scientific. The responsibility to study these patterns carefully, to communicate them without exaggeration, and to resist the long, ugly tradition of using genetic differences to rank human beings. Neanderthal ancestry does not make anyone superior or inferior. It does not separate humanity into categories worth comparing. It connects us, instead, to a longer story, one in which several human populations once shared the same landscapes, exchanged genes, and quietly shaped the biology of everyone who came after. This is not something you feel day to day, but it is something your body quietly does every time it decides how strongly to react. The ancient and the modern are not separate inside you. They are the same system, working with the same instructions, in an environment that keeps changing faster than biology can follow. Living well inside that system is not about overriding it. It is about understanding it, listening to it, and giving it the conditions it needs to function well. That is true whether the variant is recent or 50,000 years old. If you have ever been told you have an unusually strong immune response, or the opposite, I would be interested to hear your experience. You don't need to share anything personal, but if you live with an autoimmune condition, deal with persistent allergies, or have noticed unusual patterns in how your family responds to illness, your experience helps put these patterns into real context. If you're comfortable, you can also share your blood type or any moments where ancestry, biology, and medicine intersected in your life. Comments like these are how this kind of conversation grows beyond a single video. And this isn't the only place where ancient biology still shapes modern survival. In some cases, it's written directly into your blood.